On the rainy morning of January 30th, 1965, tens of thousands gathered in central London. They came to bid farewell to Winston Churchill. In the history of Britain, only 4 prominent non-royal figures had been honored with such ceremonies. Representatives from 110 countries came to pay tribute to the late leader. Millions of people around the world watched the funeral on television. The 1.5-kilometer-long funeral procession passed through historic areas of London. At the harbor, the coffin was placed on a boat and taken to Waterloo Station under the sound of gun salutes. At that moment, crane operators at the docks along the River Thames lowered their cranes to the water. It seemed that the British were not only saying goodbye to Churchill, but also to an entire era of their history. He was regarded as the Briton who had overcome the most severe challenges exactly when it was needed. Churchill's political career spanned more than 50 years. He went from being a professional military officer to serving as prime minister, and became a symbol of the British nation during his lifetime. For Churchill, the most important thing was to preserve the British Empire. He was a true and classic British imperialist. What did Churchill do to save the empire? Why was he revered by some but hated by others? What was his attitude towards the Soviet Union? On the morning of June 22, 1941, all of Britain was glued to their radios. On that day, Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered an urgent address to the nation. He announced the grim news: Hitler's Nazi Germany had attacked the Soviet Union. The words he spoke afterwards stunned everyone who knew him. A staunch opponent of communism, Churchill suddenly declared that the British would unconditionally support the heroic Soviet people. His words were filled with compassion for the fighting Russian nation. He said, "I see Russian soldiers standing on the border of their homeland, defending the fields their ancestors plowed centuries ago. I see them defending their homes. Their mothers and wives are praying. Oh yes, for at moments like these, everyone prays for the safety of their loved ones. I see tens of thousands of Russian villages where livelihoods have been wrested from the land with great difficulty. But there too are the pure joys of human life, girls laughing, children playing. And all of this is being attacked by the barbaric Nazi war machine, with their clanking hobnail boots, gleaming weapons, and spotless Prussian officers' uniforms. I also see the savage, brutish, blind, and fierce Hungarian troops advancing slowly and heavily, like a horde of creeping locusts." Churchill was delivering a brilliant speech. He spoke on the radio, declaring that this was a crime against the Russian people. He said that the Hungarians were trampling on Russian soil. The Russians, the working people, they had been robbed of everything most precious to them. I do not take back a single word I have ever said about communism. I hate that doctrine, but now, all of that must be set aside. The most important thing is to stop Hitler. The most important thing is to defeat Germany. Before you is a unique recording. This is an excerpt from Churchill's speech on June 22, 1941. Today at 4 a.m., Hitler invaded Russia. He carried out all his usual deceptions with absolute precision. Hitler is the embodiment of evil, insatiable in his bloodlust and plundering ambition. Any person or nation that stands against Nazism will receive our assistance. Thus we shall provide Russia and the Russian people with whatever help we can. From the outset, unlike Neville Chamberlain and other far-right politicians in Britain, Churchill had been a clear-eyed and sober statesman. Although he did not love the Soviet Union and disliked socialism and could not be called a great friend of our country, Churchill was a pragmatist. His speech not only resonated with the British people, but also with Soviet leaders. Stalin did not expect that such a famous enemy of the Soviet regime like Churchill would extend a helping hand. On July 3, 1941, in a radio address, Stalin thanked the British Prime Minister, and a few days later he wrote a letter to Churchill. Immediately, Stalin raised the issue of opening a second front, which he believed would be very beneficial. Churchill responded, "Yes, excellent, excellent. But at the moment, there is no capability, not enough forces." Molotov, the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, and Stalin's first deputy, flew to negotiate. He flew in a military aircraft at an unusual altitude, over territory occupied by the Germans. The Germans fired at the plane. However, that pilot still managed to bring Molotov safely to Britain. In Britain, negotiations took place, and for the first time in Soviet history, a cooperation treaty with Britain was signed. The British promised to open a second front. Peter and his accomplices in the bloody looting of Europe would now feel even more the growing strength and solidarity of the forces opposing them. The Treaty of May 26, 1942, marked an important new step in the development of Anglo-Soviet relations. Not only Churchill, but those close to him during World War II also became allies of the Soviet Union. In October 1941, the Prime Minister's wife, Clementine Churchill, founded a fund to raise money for the fighting Russia. She personally made the first donation. Throughout the war years, the fund collected more than 7 million British pounds. This money was used to purchase medical equipment, X-ray machines, prosthetics for the disabled, surgical instruments, and medicines for Soviet hospitals. The Soviet leadership greatly appreciated Mrs. Churchill's efforts. In 1945 in Moscow, she was awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Labor. During the war years, Winston Churchill visited the Soviet Union 3 times. His first visit to Moscow was on August 12, 1942. At that time, fierce battles were raging in Stalingrad, and Stalin was pressing the Western Allies to open a second front in Europe as soon as possible. The reception was not very warm. Churchill began to justify himself, while Stalin made sarcastic remarks. Churchill promised that aid would continue, and that the convoys would keep running. By 1943, it was certain a second front would be opened. Reflecting on his first visit to the Soviet Union, Churchill later wrote, "I thought about my mission in this grim and dreadful Bolshevik nation, which I had once tried to strangle in its cradle, and which, before Hitler, I had regarded as a dangerous enemy of civilized freedom. We had always hated their vile regime, and until the Nazi whip fell upon them, they had watched indifferently as we were being destroyed. Nonetheless, I was convinced that my task was to report everything to Stalin directly." Churchill's reputation as a long-time anti-Soviet figure, an enemy of the Soviet Union, was undeniable to Stalin. He understood that during wartime, Churchill had to make concessions, suppressing his anti-Soviet sentiments because it was clear that without the Soviet Union, the war could not be won. It was better for the Red Army to destroy the enemy than for the British to have to die. But Stalin also knew that once the common interest disappeared, Churchill would return to his old policies. Winston Churchill was born on November 30, 1874. His father was a nobleman with lineage tracing back to the Dukes of Marlborough, and his mother was the daughter of a wealthy American businessman. In elementary school, Churchill was not known for exemplary behavior. Every time he made a mistake, he was mercilessly beaten. After leaving school, Churchill graduated from the Royal Military Academy and was accepted into the Royal Cavalry Regiment. As a soldier, he wrote to his mother, "I want to do something extraordinary in this world. Fame is the best thing in life, to always be in the spotlight, to shine, to attract attention. That is how one should become a hero in the eyes of the public." During his military service, Churchill traveled to India, Africa, and Cuba. In wartime, he always wanted to be on the front lines, facing the enemies of the empire. Winston Churchill described his adventures in articles that were enthusiastically published in popular British newspapers and magazines. In 1899, he went to South Africa to report on the Anglo-Boer War. In the outskirts of Pretoria, he was captured and taken prisoner, only to later carry out a daring escape. At that time, Britain was suffering major defeats in the war against the Boers, and Churchill's escape from captivity became a sensational event. A great success. "Look, what heroes we have!" He had escaped from prison. Immediately, Churchill wrote articles for the Daily Telegraph and later penned a 2-volume book about his time participating in the Boer War. Churchill's love for writing books lasted throughout his life. Even as a globally famous politician, he continued writing monumental historical works. In Churchill's home, there was a study where historians, editors, and shorthand secretaries worked. They gathered materials, maps, and other documents, and after Churchill reviewed them, often at night, he would dictate the content for the secretaries to record. Throughout his life, he wrote more than 15,000 pages. Publishing books brought him a substantial income and global recognition. In 1953, with his 6-volume collection of memoirs on World War II, Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. However, the laureate did not attend the prestigious award ceremony, as he was occupied with work. "A club that has too many members is no longer a club," this politician once said. Churchill's political career began in 1901. Initially, he was elected as a member of Parliament, and later he joined the British government. At first, public speeches and debates were very challenging for Churchill. He didn't know how to deliver eloquent speeches that could engage listeners, often going off topic and stumbling over his words. Churchill fought against this weakness for many years. He memorized his speeches and practiced in front of a mirror. Churchill spoke well, but he did not have the natural talent to tap into the emotions of the crowd. He memorized his speeches but had multiple versions so that he could improvise based on the situation. Churchill's appearance wasn't the most impressive, yet he still managed to capture people's attention. His bulldog-like features became beloved by the British public. In the early 20th century, Britain was at the height of its political and economic power. Churchill admired the era of Queen Victoria throughout his life. He once wrote, "I am a child of the Victorian era. It was during that time that the foundations of our nation became solid. It was then that we led global trade and became masters of the seas. It was during that period that the sense of greatness of our empire and the duty to protect it grew within us." By the end of the 19th century, Britain held one of the top positions in the world. A quarter of the world's land was within the borders of the British Empire. Britain not only owned vast territories, but also became the world's primary industrial workshop. However, the country began to worry about its status. As a result, every effort was directed at strengthening this empire. In 1911, Churchill was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. This position was equivalent to the Minister of the Navy in Britain. Under Churchill's leadership, the British fleet was reinforced with new dreadnought-class battleships. These massive floating fortresses ensured Britain's dominance at sea during the years of the First World War. However, while heading the Admiralty, Churchill exhibited overconfidence. Despite his lack of deep knowledge in strategy and tactics, he continually gave advice to Britain's seasoned generals and admirals. Once he said, "I am always ready to learn, but I do not always like being taught." In 1915, Churchill proposed an amphibious landing to seize the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits, thereby removing Turkey, an ally of Germany, from the war. However, experienced generals opposed the plan, deeming it a foolish and unworkable idea. "No," Churchill said, "the most important thing is to seize the Dardanelles, then proceed to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula, and from there launch an attack on Constantinople." He achieved his goal. The expedition was carried out, a large force landed, but the British suffered a heavy defeat there. 45,000 British soldiers perished at Gallipoli. After the British Army's failure at Gallipoli, Churchill was dismissed and sent to the front lines. In 1917, he returned to politics with another impractical idea: the initiation of the Entente's military intervention in Russia, which was engulfed in revolution. The October Revolution and the rise of the Bolsheviks to power were viewed by Churchill as a global disaster. He wrote, "The fact is, in the iron grip of a small group of humanity's enemies who have chosen to rule through mass murder, Russia is on the verge of becoming a barbaric nation with a people no better than animals. Civilization is vanishing over vast territories, and on the ruins of cities amid mountains of corpses, the Bolsheviks are dancing and rejoicing like disgusting baboons." Their goal is to destroy all institutions of power, all governments, all nations around the world. They seek to create an international alliance of beggars, criminals, useless people, rebels, diseased, dull, and ignorant, an alliance that will encompass the entire world. Churchill saw that socialist ideas were spreading across the globe. Social Democrats had taken power in Germany. This had to be stopped, ended. Socialism had to be halted, and first and foremost, Soviet Russia needed to be extinguished. Churchill persuaded British Prime Minister Lloyd George to send an expeditionary force to Russia. In late 1917, British soldiers landed in Murmansk and Vladivostok, occupying Arkhangelsk and part of northern Russia. Churchill overlooked one crucial factor: the mindset of the British people. They didn't want this war, didn't want to lose their sons in a distant, bewildering land like Russia, and didn't want to bear the burden. As a result, the hands-off Russia movement was gaining ground in Britain at the time. British forces gradually withdrew from Russia. In the first 30 years of his political career, Churchill switched from one parliamentary party to another twice. He said, "Some people change parties for the sake of principles. Others change principles for the sake of the party. The best way to maintain consistency is to adapt to circumstances." This inconsistency of Churchill's irritated many British politicians. In the early 1930s, commentator Gardner wrote about him. He was hated by the Tories, whom he had once abandoned but later rejoined. The liberals, through whom he had risen to power, were suspicious of him. He was despised by the working class, whom he looked down upon and humiliated, and they saw him as a potential Mussolini, just waiting for a strong reaction to show his true self. By the early 1930s, many viewed Churchill not only as a political opportunist but also as backward, openly mocking the fast-growing nationalist movements in India. He said that India was merely a geographical term. Calling it a nation was like calling the equator a nation. He was hated in the House of Commons. They loathed the arrogant man who barged into every matter. The Indians hated him, and Indian terrorists prepared to assassinate Churchill. Thus, when traveling by ship, Churchill often stayed on the upper deck, fearing he would be shot by Indian terrorists. In 1929, after a failed election, he resigned. Away from political battles, Churchill's favorite pastime became painting. Whether at home or traveling around the world, Winston always carried his easel and oil paints. Primarily, he painted landscapes. In total, Churchill produced about 500 paintings. According to him, this was how he saved himself from bouts of depression. At his estate in Chartwell, Churchill built a magnificent garden and maintained a large staff of servants. The family had 5 children. The Churchill household often hosted high-ranking guests. On days when banquets were held, the table was filled with delicious dishes and expensive drinks. "My tastes are very simple. I am easily satisfied with the best," Churchill said, quoting Oscar Wilde. He was flawless in his personal life. He lived faithfully with one wife, Clementine, for 56 years. They had a strong and stable marriage. While he did drink, this was no secret, but he was never so drunk as to say foolish things in public. He smoked a lot, but that wasn't a big issue, as smoking wasn't considered a vice at that time. Churchill was always a defender of the interests of his class, the elite, and himself. He could make foreign policy shifts that his colleagues couldn't. In 1933, the Nazi Party came to power in Germany. Violating the terms of the Treaty of Versailles in 1936, Germany invaded the demilitarized Rhineland, bordering France. 2 years later, Hitler annexed Austria into the Third Reich. Soviet diplomats strongly opposed this annexation, but at that time, British and French politicians chose to negotiate with Hitler rather than Stalin. Churchill was very angry because Chamberlain delayed the formation of a strong alliance between France, Britain, and the Soviet Union, which could have isolated Hitler. Churchill said that an appeaser is one who feeds a crocodile, hoping it will eat him last. His words became prophetic. On September 1st, 1939, World War II began. After occupying Poland, the Nazi German army invaded Denmark and Norway. Britain and France almost abandoned military actions against Nazi Germany. On May 10, 1940, Hitler attacked Belgium and the Netherlands. On the same day, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain resigned. That evening, King George VI appointed Winston Churchill, then 65 years old, as Prime Minister. On May 13th, Churchill addressed the nation for the first time. He ended his speech with the famous words, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." The magnificent speech on June 4, 1940, when Churchill said, "We shall fight to the end, we shall not surrender, we shall fight on our beaches, on our rooftops, on our tennis courts. Yes, even if we lose, the British Empire will continue to fight, and we will continue the struggle." That was preparation, thorough preparation. This speech, meticulously prepared and passionately delivered, made a strong impression. During the years of World War II, Churchill became a symbol of the British nation to the entire world. He said that invincibility lies within oneself. The ability to win depends on the enemy. Winston Churchill worked hard every day to build his image. In public, he always appeared in a perfectly ironed suit, a bow tie, and never without a thick cigar in his mouth. In front of the camera, the Prime Minister was always ready to present himself to the public. He twirled his hat on his cane, quickly climbed onto tanks and fortifications. These are rare documentary footage capturing Churchill making the V sign, the symbol of victory. This symbol, created by Churchill, became his personal hallmark. This cheerful, lively, and witty nobleman captivated the common British people. Churchill became a national hero. It was the cult of Churchill's personality. Writer Herbert Wells wrote an article in November 1944 titled, "Stop Churchill," saying that this was unusual. We are worshiping Churchill like a god. A god because everyone saw that this nobleman from a ducal family went to the trenches like an ordinary person. He was ready to go into the rubble. He was everywhere with us. In the summer of 1940, France was defeated. The British prepared for the German invasion of the British Isles. On the southern coast of England, anti-tank obstacles and barriers made from old cars and carts were urgently erected. To confuse the enemy, locals dismantled all village and railway station signs. 1.5 million militia joined the self-defense forces. All men aged 18 to 50 were called up for military service. At that time, 1 in 2 workers was employed in military factories. On July 16, 1940, Hitler ordered preparations for the invasion of Britain. He placed great importance on the Air Force, with the mission of bombing major cities and destroying the fighting spirit of the British people. On September 7th, nearly 1,000 German planes attacked London. Fires broke out all over the city. The people fell into panic. Air raids occurred almost daily. In 2 months, the Germans dropped about 100,000 explosive bombs and about 1 million incendiary bombs on England. 23,000 people were killed. Another 250,000 were left homeless. Churchill and his wife personally helped those affected by the bombings. With Clementine's involvement, 9 dining rooms were organized for workers. During the London air raids, she, along with ordinary citizens, climbed onto rooftops to extinguish incendiary bombs. To detect enemy aircraft, the British deployed a radar system along the entire southern coast of England. This allowed Royal Air Force pilots to intercept the enemy as they approached the islands. In October 1940, Hitler canceled the invasion of Britain. By the spring of 1941, the intense bombing of British cities had ceased. On May 10th, a close ally of the Führer, Rudolf Hess, flew solo across the English Channel and parachuted into Scotland. What happened? Can the official German version be believed that this flight was Hess's personal initiative? Or was this flight the result of secret agreements between Britain and Germany? The fact is that after Hess's flight, the intensity of British bombings on Germany and German bombings on Britain decreased significantly. This clearly indicated that Hitler would not attack Britain, and Britain was in no hurry to cross the English Channel to help the Soviet Union. It remains unclear whether Churchill had private negotiations with Hess. The only known fact is that Churchill was very eager for Germany to attack the Soviet Union, or for the Soviet Union to attack Germany. By the summer of 1941, most of Nazi Germany's forces and its allies had been deployed to the Soviet-German front. The main danger to Britain and its colonies at that time was the advance of German forces in North Africa and the Middle East. At this time, Britain's main ally was the United States. From the beginning of the war, Churchill maintained a lively correspondence with U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt. On average, they wrote to each other 5 letters a week. The U.S. supplied the British with ammunition and weapons. In August 1941, Churchill met Roosevelt for the first time since the war began, on the American island of Newfoundland. There, the 2 leaders of the 2 great powers signed the Atlantic Charter. This document laid the foundation for a global anti-Hitler alliance. They both belonged to what is now often referred to as the collective Western Bloc. However, these were 2 very different individuals, belonging to different eras. It can be said that Roosevelt belonged to the era of neo-colonialism, while Churchill belonged to the era of classical colonialism. They frequently clashed over the understanding of concepts such as democracy, freedom, the fight against fascism, the struggle for sovereignty, independence, and so on. When Roosevelt extended his ideas about the liberation war to the colonial domain, where the British held sway, it infuriated Churchill. He was famous for saying, "Never, never, never. I will not be prime minister when the British Empire collapses." This was a cornerstone of his personal viewpoint, understanding that without this pillar he could not maintain his power. It was also a form of political courtesy, as he did not want to cede the leading position in history to Franklin Roosevelt. During the war years, Churchill worked 15 to 16 hours a day. The prime minister's workday usually began around noon. Despite the immense pressure, Churchill never lost his appetite. In the morning, he was served hearty breakfasts with chops and bacon. Lunch often included oysters, roast venison, or young grouse, along with various desserts. Additionally, his table always featured French wine and cognac, which Churchill drank almost daily and in large quantities. Once he said, "When I was young, I made it a rule not to drink a drop of alcohol before lunch. Now that I am no longer young, I keep the rule not to drink a drop of alcohol before breakfast. I have gotten more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me." Late at night, Churchill received politicians and generals for reports. The Prime Minister never went to bed before 4 a.m. Such a schedule quickly affected his health. Churchill suffered several heart attacks, but even so, he never lost his optimism. "At my age, I cannot afford to feel unwell," the Prime Minister said. During the war years, he traveled extensively around the world. In total, Churchill spent over 1,000 hours on ships and planes, covering more than 200,000 kilometers. Generally speaking, I must say that this generation of politicians stood out for their great courage. After all, crossing the ocean on a cruiser like Roosevelt or Churchill did, or constantly being in the air, flying from one front to another, required personal bravery. For example, Churchill even left not a will, but at least a certain letter, in which he warned that, in the event of his death, his successor should be Anthony Eden, who was then serving as Foreign Secretary. In 1942, Churchill proposed to Roosevelt to launch campaigns against Germany in the Mediterranean region. According to Churchill's plan, by the end of 1943, the Allies had achieved victories over Germany in North Africa and Sicily. Nevertheless, American generals humorously referred to Churchill's strategy as an attempt to extinguish hellfire with snowballs. Roosevelt leaned towards the view that it was time to open a second front in northern France. This was also what Stalin demanded, but Churchill deliberately delayed. He said, "If you think I am delaying because of fear of losses, that is not the case. But the thought that I would have to witness the destruction of an entire generation of young Britons is unbearable." Throughout the war, particularly Churchill, hoped that forces within Germany, with hopes dating back to 1938, would be able to carry out a coup, remove Hitler, and open a front in the West. At that point, Western forces could easily, in quotes, liberate Europe. This idea was deeply ingrained in Churchill's mind. He tried to entice Roosevelt with this idea, but Roosevelt, of course, was a more practical person. Churchill delayed the opening of the Second Front until mid-1944. The Allied landings in northern France only began on June 6th. On August 25th, the Allies liberated Paris. In September, German forces retreated from northern France and established defenses on the Siegfried Line in Belgium. Here, the Allies became embroiled in fierce battles. Paris's advance was halted for nearly 4 months. At this time, the Soviet Red Army had liberated most of Eastern Europe and quickly approached the German border, crushing what remained of Hitler's elite divisions. Churchill did not expect that by mid-1944, the Soviet Red Army would have carried out almost a blitzkrieg. They had broken into Europe, they advanced into eastern Poland, they advanced into eastern Czechoslovakia. In no time, they captured Romania, they advanced into Bulgaria, and threatened Greece. Churchill urgently went to meet Stalin. Churchill went to Moscow primarily to negotiate with Stalin about spheres of influence. This was the famous agreement where Churchill proposed to Stalin, as he called it, a naughty document, which simply recorded the percentage of influence that the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom would have in various countries. The relationship between Churchill and Stalin during the war years was very trusting. During his visit to Moscow in October 1944, Churchill hosted a grand banquet with a formal dinner for the Soviet delegates. For the first time in his life, Stalin visited the British embassy. In return, the Soviet leader invited Churchill to a ballet at the Bolshoi Theater. On the day the British delegation departed, Stalin personally went to the airport to bid farewell to the Prime Minister. Churchill's final effort to protect British interests in Eastern Europe was made in February 1945 at the Yalta Conference. During the negotiations, the parties discussed the post-war borders of Poland, war reparations, and the division of Germany. Throughout the debates, Churchill and Roosevelt were forced to accept all the main demands of the Soviet delegation. They could not change anything. The most important thing was that everything was a consequence of previous strategic decisions. If they had liberated Central and Eastern Europe, the conversation would have been different, but they did not want to open a second front earlier. They let the Soviet Red Army liberate Central and Eastern Europe. In that sense, everything else stemmed from this obvious fact. Changing the undeniable truth and stripping the Soviet Union of its presence and influence in these countries was impossible. Those who can win wars rarely have the ability to build a lasting peace, and those who can do that never win wars, Churchill said. After the Allies defeated Nazi Germany, he returned to the idea of opposing communism. In 1945, Churchill ordered the development of a war plan against the Soviet Union. To counter the Red Army, he planned to use Wehrmacht prisoners of war. Later, Churchill suggested to U.S. President Truman to attack the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. Churchill's vision of the New World was expressed on March 5, 1946, when he spoke at a college in the town of Fulton, USA. Churchill stated that this was not the Europe they had fought for. An iron curtain had been erected from the Adriatic to the Baltic. The Soviet Union was establishing its regime. This was essentially the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, other officials remained silent. Churchill, the retired leader, spoke, but it became the signal for the beginning of the Cold War. The post-war years became a period of severe trials for Churchill. In 1945, he lost the parliamentary election and was forced to resign. In 1947, a new shock came to him. The British Parliament granted independence, which he vehemently opposed. Churchill called Winston now facing great difficulties. On the day the British delegation departed, Stalin personally went here. Churchill's final effort to protect British interests in Eastern Europe was made in February 1945 at the Yalta Conference. During the negotiations, the parties discussed the post-war borders of Poland, war reparations, and the division of Germany. Throughout the debates, Churchill and Roosevelt were forced to accept all the main demands of the Soviet delegation. They could not change anything. The most important thing was that everything was a consequence of previous strategic decisions. If they had liberated Central and Eastern Europe, the conversation would have been different. But they did not want to open a second front earlier. They let the Soviet Red Army liberate Central and Eastern Europe. In that sense, everything else stemmed from this obvious fact. Changing the undeniable truth and stripping the Soviet Union of its presence and influence in these countries was impossible. Those who can win wars rarely have the ability to build a lasting peace. And those who can do that never win wars, Churchill said. After the Allies defeated Nazi Germany, he returned to the idea of opposing communism. In 1945, Churchill ordered the development of a war plan against the Soviet Union. To counter the Red Army, he planned to use Wehrmacht prisoners of war. Later, Churchill suggested to U.S. President Truman to attack the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. Churchill's vision of the New World was expressed on March 5, 1946, when he spoke at a college in the town of Fulton, USA. Churchill stated that this was not the Europe they had fought for. An iron curtain had been erected from the Adriatic to the Baltic. The Soviet Union was establishing its regime. This was essentially the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, other officials remained silent. Churchill, the retired leader, spoke, but it became the signal for the beginning of the Cold War. The post-war years became a period of severe trials for Churchill. In 1945, he lost the parliamentary election and was forced to resign. In 1947, a new shock came to him. The British Parliament granted independence to India, which he vehemently opposed. Churchill's friends recalled, "Winston is now facing great difficulties." He was convinced that the country was being pushed into an economic crisis. According to him, the anxiety he felt during the battle for Britain was just a minor concern compared to his current feelings. Within the family, Churchill said, "The empire I once believed in is no more. I have done so much, but in the end, I have achieved nothing." Churchill worried that in the New World, the role of the United Kingdom would be diminished. This can be explained by a series of objective reasons. The difficulties in maintaining the previous quality of the United Kingdom, the economic and political competition with the United States. In general, there was a perception that in the New World, the United States and the Soviet Union would occupy special positions. After resigning, Churchill traveled extensively and wrote books. However, he could not completely leave politics. In 1951, amid the outbreak of an economic crisis in England, Winston Churchill, now 77 years old, once again became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He was considered a symbol of British spirit, someone who had overcome the most difficult challenges at the necessary time. Therefore, Churchill was loved by the people and ready to be elected. But in the 1950s, Churchill could not surpass himself. The post-war issues of the country required new and complex approaches, which were too challenging for someone who had endured so much pressure from global fame. Churchill's declining health also hindered his ability to achieve the same success as before. Strokes and hearing problems forced him to retire from politics. On April 5, 1955, he submitted his resignation to the Queen. In one of his final speeches, Churchill said, "Perhaps one day, tolerance and love for fellow humans, justice, and freedom will prevail. Then the suffering generations will find peace. But until then, do not give up. Do not let yourself fall into despair, and never lose heart." On a Sunday afternoon, January 24, 1965, Winston Churchill passed away. In 2002, the British recognized him as the greatest figure in the history of the United Kingdom.